Today, we're thrilled to have with us three experts to talk about trade, China, the WTO, the TPP, the CPTPP, and other trade alliances. Our guests are Ronald Kirk, Senior of Counsel at Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, and the United States Trade Representative in the first Obama administration. He is also a former mayor of Dallas. Clete Willems is a partner at Akin, Gump. He previously served in the Trump White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics and Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. And Chad Bown is the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We'll hear from each of the panelists and then have plenty of time for Q&A. You can raise your Zoom hand or put a question into the Q&A text function. And please tweet today at #NPFTrade. So welcome all. I'm thrilled to have you here this morning. We're going to talk about trade, primarily trade alliances, but China is a big part of that, and so we'll just kind of take it from there. We're gonna go to Ambassador Kirk first, and he's going to talk kind of about what his mindset was coming into the USTR position at the top of the Biden administration, and then give some comparisons to how things look right now. And then we'll go to Clete Willems, and then we'll go to Chad Bown. But for now, I want to welcome Ambassador Kirk, and hope you can kind of give us the mind frame of what the USTR does and what you are seeking to do at the top of the Biden or the top of the Obama administration.
Good morning, Chris. Thank you for having me. Clete, good to see you again. And Chad, always good to be with you. Let me say at the outset that although I think there are some similarities between the environment writ large that the Biden-Harris administration is coming into versus what we inherited during the first term of the Obama-Biden administration, there are similar in that I think the overriding issue, which should be in focus of not only the president and vice president and the health team, but the entire new administration is going to be to get control of this pandemic and to do everything we can to try to get America's economy going and America back to work. Now, you wouldn't think of trade as having a role within that, but as we know, and we don't have to go into that here, because of issues of tariffs and supply chains, they did play some role, at least in making sure that Americans and particularly physicians had access to the supplies and technology they needed to combat that. But I said that the administration, the president and vice president will spend all of their time on this pandemic and the economy, which gives the foreign policy team a pretty broad runway to begin to lay the grounds for what will be the administration's policy objectives later. In the business world, I think it is more easily the principle that who's on the bus is more readily acceptable than we think of in governmental terms, but I would think it's the same. In government, we put it a different way, that personnel is policy. And I think for those that want to see the administration take a more collaborative approach to some of these bigger issues that we're going to talk about and that Chad's written about extensively, you should be comforted that the president has put together such a seasoned professional team from a very skilled trade negotiator and litigator in Catherine Tai at USTR, to Secretary Blinken. You mentioned you're going to have Secretary Vilsack on. We don't often think of agriculture, or we don't think enough of the critical role that agriculture plays in our trade policy, but they do. And right on down the line from Secretary Yellen and others at Commerce. And so I think if you look at that team, you can reason that I don't think the approach will be identical to that in the Biden administration, but it will be a team that will have much more respect, I think, for our traditional alliances and the global institutions, much as then Senator Biden had when he chaired the Senate Finance Committee all those years. And I think we've seen evidence of that, Chris, already, and how quickly The president has moved to re-engage on everything from climate change and NATO, and more critically for this audience, the administration moving last week to drop our objections, which I think embarrassingly so, really being the only country that blocked the appointment of the new Director General of the World Trade Organization in Minister Okono-Iweala, who is supremely qualified for that. All of those at least signal a difference in approach. But as we will get to later in the conversation, we're still going to have our challenges ahead. I mean, you saw the statements from Merkel and others that while they welcomed the United States back to this traditional trade alliance that we have, particularly as we're going to get to how we might confront China, we still have work to do. You know, I like to, as a former mayor, I tend to speak it more colloquially, but I tell people it's kind of like, you know, having a dust up with your spouse and you have a little bit of a breakup and they take you back, but you know everything's not all right. There's going to be quite a bit of period of time of having to go back and earn that trust. And that's what we're going to have to do. But I think we have a team in place to do that. I think in the interim, Ambassador Tai will use that time wisely, one, to, you know, obviously introduce herself, reintroduce herself as an ambassador, not as a staffer, and that is important. And that's one thing I've shared with Catherine, whom I was privileged to work with the USTR. As talented as she has to understand now, USTR is the only agency created by Congress and given the sole responsibility to speak for and negotiate on behalf of not only the president, but the US Congress. And so she's got to make sure she understands that while she will enjoy, I think, a lot of currency, certainly with our oversight committees, the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance committees, that she now speaks for the president. And the sooner that she can develop that relationship and give countries with whom she will be negotiating the confidence that when she speaks, they're hearing from President Biden, I think the more effective she will be. And I think Clete probably understands it better than anybody, having been within the White House in that role. But I know we want to get to the other speakers, but broadly, I don't think we're going to see any immediate policy goals. There never is, notwithstanding all of the cries we will hear that the administration doesn't have a trade policy. He does. I think the vice president clearly understands the United States has to be engaged in the world's economy in order for us to have a healthy economy, but that has to be in a much more collaborative and thoughtful way.
Okay, well, let me ask one question, then we'll move on to Clete. When you came into office in 2009, we were going from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration. Now we're going from a Republican administration to Democratic administration. You know, but I mean, how much continuity was there from the Bush to the Obama years, and how? I mean, I'm assuming there was a lot more continuity as compared with what is a far more kind of abrupt change from Trump to Obama, from Trump to Biden. Is that a fair assumption?
You know, they're always, look, what has earned the United States the unique role that we play in global affairs is that we are a fairly constant voice for certain principles, particularly as it relates to the rule of law, fair play, abiding by norms. Now that will be nuanced from Democratic to Republican administration. And we often are confronted with complaints from different partners around the world. Well, nothing really changes. You know, when you go from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama, but it'll change in the nuance. I mean, I saw it as low-hanging fruit, frankly. In our case, for example, we inherited unpassed trade agreements with Korea, Panama, and Colombia because of different objections with each one, but a lot of them around issues that were important, particularly to labor and Democratic constituencies. I thought that was a gift to us because I immediately reached out to labor. I met with every union head, invited them back to the table. We reconstituted the labor task force chaired by USTR and the labor group. Now, that didn't get labor all on board, but that was critical to our ability 3 years later to be able to do something unprecedented. And that was pass all three of those trade agreements in one night, along with renewing the trade adjustment assistance program for displaced workers. So I think you'll see some of those same strategies, but that'll be up to Ambassador Ty. I came in more as a trade ombudsman from my experience. You know, most mayors are at the forefront of trade promotion. Ambassador Ty represents that generation, that universe of trade secretaries like, say, Carla Hills and Sue Schwab and others that are trade technicians. So I had to spend my time sort of learning the trade language. I think Ambassador Ty will need to learn the politics of trade so that we can navigate all these different constituencies out there. But I saw it as an opportunity to begin to build those coalitions that we would need to move forward our trade agreement. And we also used it as an opportunity to make a commitment to address the one issue we heard from both those who were critical of our trade policy and those who benefited from it, that they wanted a much more stronger enforcement initiative, particularly among our allies that they thought were taking advantage of us. I know we tend to always think that was China, but interestingly enough, one of the things we talked about, Chris, I sat down with my legal team and did a review of every trade dispute that we had outstanding. Overwhelmingly, the largest number of them were with the European Union. Now, that did not surprise me. That's our oldest, most trusted trade partner. And over a relationship that long, you're going to have disputes. But I thought it was important to get our team to understand we needed to do everything we could to resolve these more quickly, that having a 14-year beef, no pun intended, with the European Union over cattle. And I asked my team, I said, how many of these guys do you think are still in business? These aren't Boeing and Facebook. These are small businesses. So anyway, we used that time to try to build up our enforcement creds. And eventually that led us to the successful track record we had of bringing more suits against China and being successful with all of those, which is why it's critical the U.S. has moved to restore and begin to work with the WTO, particularly to make the appellate body even more relevant, because we're going to need it.
Okay, well, that's a perfect segue to Clete Willems. Clete, can you tell us, what was the Trump administration's objectives with the WTO, and what has changed since then, and how much is the Biden administration will be facing the same WTO challenges as the Trump administration did? So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Good morning, and I'd be happy to do so. And I want to say, I think I can dovetail on my old boss, Ambassador Kirk's answer in a couple different ways. And I fundamentally agree with him. And the point that he was making is that there's generally a lot of continuity in U.S. trade policy from one administration to the next. I think if you look at some of the hot button issues out there, this is one of the least partisan. And I think as you look at the WTO, I think you're going to see that once again. Now, yes, absolutely, there will be shifts in rhetoric. There may be shifts in tactic. And I think that the Biden administration will give the overall approach of being more committed to multilateralism. But when it comes down to the nuts and bolts in terms of what's working at the WTO and what's not, and what needs to be fixed, you're going to see a lot of overlap. So let me go through that quickly and give you some predictions of how I think the Biden administration will deal with some of these things. The place to start is to think about what is the WTO supposed to do? Three things. We call them the three pillars. Number one, it's supposed to negotiate agreements that set standards, global rules that we need to follow, whether it's protecting intellectual property, lowering tariffs, and generally liberalizing our markets, avoiding having too many subsidies in place, things of that nature. Now, the WTO in 1994, 1995 actually when it started, but 94 when we concluded the negotiations. It had a set of rules that really helped lower tariffs around the world, raised standards for intellectual property, did a bunch of great things. The problem is it really has not been modernized in any significant way in 25 years. We don't have agreements that deal with some of the most pressing issues that the Biden administration is talking about, environment and labor. We don't have rules that deal with digital technologies. We don't have rules that deal with some of the biggest problems from China. And we have rules in place that are very inequitable in terms of how much we have to lower our tariff rates. The US under WTO rules is required to have much lower tariffs than China. And I just think we're at the point in time where that isn't seen as fair or just given China's rise within the international economy. And so there's a very big need here to update the rules. And I will say the Trump administration, the Biden administration, just like the Trump administration, is going to find that there are two big impediments to that. The first one is the need for consensus. Everyone has to agree. And you do have certain countries, yes, China probably doesn't want to agree on things that deal with state-owned enterprises or non-market economics, but India and South Africa have been a thorn in the side of the US negotiators for years, not wanting to update the rules, not wanting to liberalize, and essentially arguing that liberalization is anti-development. And I think the last administration hit the nail on the head when they said there's really a philosophical difference here about what the WTO is and should do moving forward. And I think that's going to remain a problem for the Biden folks. There's also the related problem of developing country status, again, where certain countries like China say they don't need to take on the same level of commitment as the United States. And we're just not in a position politically or economically where that should be the case. The second thing that the WTO does is dispute settlement. So we've got the set of rules. Someone breaks those rules, we need to enforce it. And the appellate body has been great for us in many ways. The US has won more disputes than anyone else. We've got a great track record. Ambassador Kirk can tell you that as well. We won a lot of cases on behalf of our farmers and our workers in the United States. But there are some serious problems with it as well. The big one that you hear about is an issue of overreach, where the appellate body, there have been certain issues where the US wanted to give itself policy space, such as on trade remedies. And the appellate body basically read that out of the agreement and said, this is the exact way in which you have to implement your anti-dumping duties, your countervailing duties. And by the way, it's really, really restrictive and doesn't let you deal with the problems posed by China. So there's this issue of overreach and filling in the gaps because the negotiators haven't been able to update the agreements. The appellate body comes in and fills in those gaps. A second problem is the length of time it takes to get a resolution. It's really hard, and I'm in the private sector now instead of in government. It's really hard for me to go to one of my clients and say, you've got a trade problem, go to the WTO, get USTR to bring a case, and maybe in 7 or 8 years, you'll have a resolution. It's a lot easier to say, try to get them to bring a 301, and then you can have tariffs in 12 months. And so we really need to figure out how to make the system shorter. And you also, I think, have this problem where there's an imbalance between the members and the institution. You have a secretariat that has grown in strength and really makes these decisions. And in many ways, from the US perspective, is trying to build a global court. And so that's the dispute settlement system. And then finally, the last one is the third pillar is on transparency and monitoring. And really what this is about is you notify your measures to the WTO, you tell them how much subsidies you're providing. And it's really important for traders to have certainty about the environment in which they're trying to sell their goods. It's important for WTO members to be able to know what others are doing so they can assess whether they are violating those agreements. And the compliance rate on that stuff has been between 25 and 50% for most of the agreements, which is really terrible. And so you've got all three of the pillars that have not been living up to the ideal that they were set out to achieve, to liberalize trade, to provide certainty, to expeditiously resolve disputes between the members. And so I think, let me talk a little bit about how the Biden administration is going to approach this and contrast it with Trump. First thing is, I think there is going to be a clear difference of rhetoric, and they're not going to fight the fights that are unwinnable. Perfect example is the Director General. Look, I get why the Trump administration took the position they did. The Koreans showed a lot of courage and leadership under Trade Minister Yu. They were one of the only countries to give up their developing country status to say we've graduated and that we're no longer going to ask for special treatment. So I think Trade Minister Yu is also a trade expert, whereas Ngozi, again, people say great things about her. I don't know her personally. She seems like, she has a lot of charisma and maybe can be a leader. But let's be honest, compared to a trade minister, her learning curve on trade is pretty significant. And so, look, so that's why the U.S. objected, but they were never going to win that. And so it was really an easy move for the Biden administration to just come in and say, look, everyone else wants the other person. This is a consensus organization. We're never going to win. So I think, it just shows this engagement. I think the rhetoric's not going to be as harsh about the WTO. And I think they're going to look for small wins. We can talk about this in greater depth in the questions. I mean, there's some small places to get some wins when it relates to the coronavirus. Maybe we can finally get fisheries subsidies across the finish line, but those aren't big deals. I mean, I think those are small things. Then when it comes to the negotiations, I think the Trump administration probably gets less credit than it deserves for really trying to reform the negotiating function, trying to propose new agreements. Very robust commitment from the Trump administration. And there were some successes, as I mentioned, on the developing country status issue with Korea, with Brazil, with Taiwan, all relinquishing their status. But there's fundamentally a consensus problem there. And I think the Biden administration will have to think long and hard about how they're going to get through that, whether plurilaterals are viable under the WTO or whether they're going to have to look at something else. And I do think that's going to be one of the hardest areas. And again, we can get into greater depth what they're going to do. I would say in that area, probably going to be more or less a continuation of the Trump approach, which was robust. One thing they're already signaling is that they want to renegotiate the government procurement agreement to make sure that they can have more robust Buy American proposals. I think it's going to be a very hard negotiation. Dispute settlement, I think this is where you will see a shift in tactics, but not a shift in strategy or objective. And I think we got a taste of that yesterday, where the USTR at the dispute settlement body hearing in Geneva said point blank, we have systemic concerns about the appellate body. Therefore, we are not going to lift the objection to the appointment of new appellate body members. And so there again, you have a continuity in policy. I think where they will be different is they will put ideas on the table in a way that the Trump administration did not. But in terms of overall objective, there's continuity. And I like to remind folks that the first block of an appellate body reappointment happened during the Obama administration in 2016. This wasn't just a Trump thing. Finally, transparency and monitoring, again, I think a similar approach to the Trump administration, which is to try to get more compliance with those. So let me just conclude in just saying, look, the theme I'm giving you is you're going to have continuity and objectives. These are bipartisan concerns. I think you're going to have a much more friendly and welcoming rhetoric. I think you're going to have symbolic actions to show engagement. I think you're going to have attempts at small victories to build momentum for the multilateral system. But I think at the end of the day, the Biden administration is going to run into the same roadblocks that Ambassador Kirk talked about. And they're going to come from places like China, who doesn't want to have more market-oriented policies. They're going to come from places like India and South Africa, who do not believe that trade liberalization is good for development. And I think they're going to have to decide what they want to do. And this brings me to what I see as one of the biggest tensions in the Biden administration's policy right now. And that is this notion that they want to set the rules. They want to work with allies, set global rules for trade, but that they don't want to negotiate new trade agreements. And they can try through the WTO for a while, but I think ultimately they're going to reach the conclusion it's really, really hard at the WTO, and we've got to find ways outside of the WTO to put pressure on the WTO. And that's going to bring us to everyone's favorite, the TPP, which quite frankly, I get it. It's politically difficult, but if you want to do this, that is your instrument. They need to find a way to get back there. They're not going to be able to just jump in headfirst to the whole comprehensive agreement. But I hope what we see is building block agreements in the region, a digital trade agreement with Australia, digital trade agreements with Singapore, sectorals with Japan, and that builds up the Indo-Pacific, it builds up the TPP partners, and then eventually we can turn that into a really gold standard agreement that puts pressure on the WTO, which if everyone will remember, the reason we got updated rules in 1994 for the WTO is because what we did on NAFTA. And so I think that ultimately that is the playbook to fixing the WTO. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you much. So I just want to remind all of our listeners out there that you can ask questions. If you see the little yellow raise hand button at the bottom, you can raise your hand and we'll work you in for a audio question. We'll turn the microphone over to you. You can also submit a question via the Q&A chat function, and we're getting some questions there, and we'll get to those in a second. But first, we want to hear from Chad Bown, who's going to kind of talk about the what he calls the collective action issue or collective action problem, and how nations around the world are going to work together or not work together on trade alliance issues. So Chad, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Clete, Ambassador Kirk, it's a pleasure to be here with you as well. So what I thought I would use my kind of opening minutes is to pivot maybe away from the WTO and talk about the elephant in the room, which is China. And because I think when you hear about the Biden administration talking about alliances on trade, inevitably that's kind of where things are going back to. So what does that mean in practice? Well, I think historically, and Ambassador Kirk already talked about this a bit, one of the kind of the two big tools the United States had been using, I think prior to the Trump administration, to think about the challenges that China addressed were WTO dispute settlement. So between when we started filing disputes against China around 2006 and the entry of the Trump administration, we brought, I forget, more than 20 against China and fewer than a dozen against the rest of the world combined. It was basically, we were using dispute settlement at the WTO to hold its feet to the fire. Now, we can suggest that that wasn't enough and that was never going to be enough, but that was done not only with the WTO, but frequently with allies as well. So you had disputes, whether it was on rare earths or various subsidies, where the Europeans would come along, the Canadians would come along, the Japanese would come along, and this collective pressure would help get China to ultimately comply with these legal rulings. So it was that and TPP, right? Creating new rules, updating the rule book in a way that the WTO process had effectively blocked on the negotiating side. I agree with Clete there. That was the approach to kind of deal with what were the foreseeable challenges in thinking about China. Now, obviously, around 2013, 2014, China has changed its trajectory and becoming more and more state-oriented since that period of time, and it escalated, during the period of the Trump administration. Kind of the second half of the Obama administration took an additional bilateral approach with China on the bilateral investment treaty negotiations. And the Europeans ultimately did this as well. A lot of the elements that were in the bilateral investment treaty negotiations on the American side were ultimately captured in the phase one agreement, some rules and disciplines on forced technology transfer. The Europeans got similar provisions in their recent CAI agreement with China. But I think what both realized, the Obama administration with bilateral investment treaty that didn't ever get to the finish line, the Trump administration with phase one, and the Europeans with CAI, is the issues of systemic reform with China can't be handled bilaterally. So when you're talking about the issues of, in particular, Chinese subsidies and their state-owned enterprises and those types of things that we're worried about, none of us can work with China on our own to deal with those areas of concern. And I'm an economist. I was actually at the Council of Economic Advisors during the first term of the Obama administration. So indirectly, I worked for Ambassador Kirk as well on these trade issues. But from an economics perspective, the reason why this isn't going to work is it's a little bit paradoxical, but the issue is none of us, individual countries or the European Union, this collection of countries, has enough incentive to push the job ahead on our own. And the reason why is because if China ultimately becomes more market-oriented, starts protecting intellectual property rights better, that not only benefits American companies and American workers, but it's also going to benefit the Japanese companies and workers, the European, the German companies and workers. And what that means is we don't have enough incentive as Americans to do the job all by ourselves. We're never going to push the Chinese far enough all by ourselves to get the job done. if this is something that we're actually concerned about, we need to do it collectively with the same sorts of allies that have the same interests that we do. So under the Trump administration, so what's the path forward on this particular set of issues? And I'm not optimistic that a fully fledged WTO single undertaking kind of agreement could ever work for, I think, the reasons that Clete laid out. But under the Trump administration, what had been happening sort of along the sidelines was this thing called the Trilateral Initiative, where the Europeans and the Japanese and the administration got together periodically and were trying to develop some new rules to ultimately someday create some perhaps plurilateral, a group of countries would sign up, the most important countries, disciplines on things like subsidies. Obviously, COVID hit, and that ran into some difficulties, but I think that is a potential path forward. The Europeans, sort of in recognition of the changeover in the administration in December, released a 11, 12-page document, kind of elucidating what they saw as an action plan for engagement with the United States in the new administration in areas of joint concern. And one of those key areas, of course, was China. So they proposed, working together on these issues of subsidies, industrial subsidies in particular, but also going further than that, working on areas of common concern on technology, on export controls, say. So if you're thinking about semiconductors and 5G and those types of issues, foreign investment screening, right? The common concerns that we might have with the Chinese approach there. In any case, there is a path. The Europeans have sent signals, and the Biden administration, we're still waiting to hear any details about what it means when they say that they want to work with allies. I think they're studying it, trying to learn about what the imminent concerns are and what the potential paths forward are. But I think there is a roadmap there for how one might engage to go down this path. That being said, no one should be thinking that this is going to be easy. Right? We've never actually done this before in any sort of real sense. So the first thing that would have to happen is we would have to settle all of the internal squabbles that I think Ambassador Kirk pointed out rightly that are in the family first, right? And if we're talking about beef or genetically modified foods or Boeing and Airbus subsidies, all of these things that we have been unable, the appellate body and trade remedies in the United States, all of these relatively minor, small things in the context of when you're thinking about the bigger issue of China, but nonetheless have been holding us back in terms of being able to work collectively. So we have to first resolve those kind of internal differences between ourselves and some of these other key alliance partners, and then turn to the kind of collective approach. That's potentially a path forward, I think, for the Biden administration. They've sent signals, but I think actually operationalizing that in practice is going to be quite a challenge. So I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So we have some questions coming in, and I have a handful of questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. This program we have a hard stop at 10 a.m. Eastern. A couple of the speakers need to move on to other things in their day job. But I do want to start with Ambassador Kirk. As Clete was talking about, and I see he wrote recently, he was talking about the 3 pillars of the WTO: negotiations, implementation, and monitoring, and dispute settlement requiring drastic reform. I'd like to get your sense on just that notion that Ambassador Kirk, that the WTO pillars require drastic reform, and in general, I mean, do you think the U.S. is getting a fair shake at the WTO?
Could be, I could argue, yeah, well, one, I certainly agree with Clete. I don't know that I'd use the word drastic, but they need reform. I mean, no, look, I'm a Texan. I was blessed to become mayor of Dallas 6 months after NAFTA went into effect. No state has benefited from not only NAFTA, but trade any more than the state of Texas. But I was one of those leading proponents that after 25 years, NAFTA needed modernization. I mean, we don't drive the same kind of cars with the same safety features that we did 25 years ago. We certainly don't use technology These institutions need reforming, they need modernizing, they need updating. And yes, one, I agree with Clete, but I would also say, and one, Chris, the reality is all three of us think alike on this stuff. I agree with Clete. The reason that we launched, or at least I won't say launched, we were privileged to make the decision for the U.S. to go down the path of negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership and others. And I argued with my colleagues at the WTO all the time that for the reasons, I'll try not to be duplicitous, that Clete said, you're just not going to get agreement among 150, plus countries, and waiting for the Doha angel to come down, I thought was a waste of time, that we needed to get points on the board. I saw TPP as a path to doing that. So the WTO does need reform. It is going to be difficult. And I think I agree wholeheartedly with Clete that in the interim, the U.S. can't just sit and wait for that to happen. We have to be more thoughtful about how we use these other multilateral tools to be able to do that. Where I might differ with Clete, I'm much more of my experience as a mayor, the chance to do big things comes along infrequently enough that you've got to reach for as much as you can. And so I'm just not a big believer. As hard as it is to get trade matters through our Congress, the thought of doing building blocks 4 or 5 to get to TPP, at some point, we're going to have to come to a realization it is still the most efficient tool that we have, first of all, to help keep our economy rooted in one of the fastest growing parts of the world, but also as a strategy, a part of that containing China. And I do want to say one other thing, and I agree with Chad totally. I think it was, for many of us, it was too easy to say, oh my God, the Trump administration is just, a bull in a china shop. They're bungling all of this. And in a way, we've given China a pass. To go back to Chad's point, this is going to be a very difficult proposition. This is not the same China with the same ambition that we welcomed to the World Trade Organization over 20 years ago. This is a China that has taken a decidedly different turn as it relates to modernizing and liberalizing their economy. And so we had better be prepared to have a thoughtful, reasoned, collective approach, but be in this for the long haul, but be willing to use these other tools that we have in the meantime.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in here. This is a fairly a broad one. I'd like Chad to take a whack at this first. This is from Caroline Messakar from Argus Media. Is there a risk that the level of ambition will fall when the roadblocks emerge? I mean, I guess that's in terms of trying to move forward on these different alliances. Are we gonna stall out because of some of the persistent roadblocks?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the inherent challenges that we have had kind of in engaging with the allies, right? Is that, we have traditionally been, as the Americans have been more gung-ho about getting stricter disciplines on subsidies and state-owned enterprises because we have fewer of them, right? State-owned enterprises, certainly the Europeans, the French especially, and other countries in Europe are more familiar with state-owned enterprises, right? And so they have defensive equities, defensive concerns about any new rules that have to get written. And so, yeah, that is one of the challenges that I think we're coming up with in even getting this process started. That being said, as Ambassador Kirk just said, China is getting bigger, every day. And there's a sense in which if you want to try to develop new rules, because there's areas of how its economy is evolving that you're very, very concerned about, you have to do it sooner than later, right? And so you're going to have to make these internal compromises so that you can actually get started on the bigger picture challenges that confront you.
Okay.
Can I jump in on this for a second? Yeah, because I want to first endorse Chad's remarks about systemic reform can't be handled bilaterally. I mean, I agree completely. I was a negotiator in the phase 1 deal. I can tell you how hard it was. I mean, we did not get provisions in that deal that dealt with the big structural issues when it comes to SOEs, when it comes to industrial subsidies. The Europeans really didn't either. If you look at the CAI, they're talking about it, but if you actually look at the provisions, they're very minuscule and in some ways just sort of restate some WTO provisions. So the only way this ever gets done is if you do it with a bunch of countries pushing China, trying to portray China as an outlier, and then getting them to change. China doesn't like to be seen as an international outlier. And so I think we need to use that to our advantage. But the ambition problem is real. And Chad talked about the trilateral. I was there when we launched the trilateral. It's a great initiative, but the problem is we couldn't even agree among the three of us on what an industrial subsidy was. And part of the reason, and I don't want to point fingers at anyone, but some we felt from the U.S. perspective that some of the others were sort of trying to protect their own. They wanted to preserve their own industrial subsidies. And I think at the end of the day, and this is where I want to go back to Ambassador Kirk's remark about, I'm a technician maybe more than a politician. But the point is, at some point, we got to say, you know what? Maybe we're going to have to give up a little on what we're able to do, or maybe we're going to get sued on our industrial subsidies, but it's worth it for the greater good because China's are so much bigger and so much more distorting in the global economy. And so we're going to have to do some things that are politically unpopular at home in order to get the big fish, which is to fix the China problem. And I think that's where we're at right now with the EU and Japan. Now, what I recommend is sort of thinking about bringing in another country that can use a level of ambition. And I like the idea of Australia. I just think there's someone who has shown ambition on these issues. They're going down this path with China right now, and they might help us, help us expand our level of ambition and try to get to results. So just want to throw that out there.
And if I could, Chris, I know you've got other questions. I think the other thing, look, we've been at this long enough. The advantage of having a team like this, which I love this, and thank you. I mean, you've got the technician, you've got more the politician, you've got the sort of thought leader in Chad. Look, we didn't just show up to this game and go, oh my God, what do we do with China? We've been at this now, arguably since before, but the most recent engagement started with Nixon and Kissinger. We know our opponent, but we can also be thoughtful and about what's the environment most conducive for China to be able to take any of these steps. One thing I do know, it isn't going to happen with the U.S. coming and slamming the table and saying, you're doing it, we made you do it. Because not just China, no country's going to do that. And so, I mean, I think it argues for Chad's approach that it has to be done collectively, has to be done in a spirit. When we have seen China take steps, Clete, whether you think of them as small or incremental, they have been when it was part of a broader engagement, and they could, quote unquote, save face. And I think we've got to be smart enough, tactical enough to realize if that's what it takes, that's the approach that we're going to have to take.
Okay. So I got another question here, but first, Chad, you and Clete both mentioned CAI. Chad, could you give us the 30-second definition of what CAI is?
Yeah, so CAI is the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that the European Union just signed at the end of 2019 with China. And so it's kind of like a bilateral investment treaty. It's got essentially China to agree to open up some of its financial services markets to European firms, the same kind of stuff that Clete got for us in the phase 1 agreement. China agreed to some, minor disciplines on subsidies, but for services, and it was mainly on notifications. So and then China says it will do more things to abide by, labor regulations in the ILO, and I think that's where it's going to be politically controversial in Europe to getting this thing passed. But it's kind of it's an investment agreement, not a trade agreement. And it was in many respects just kind of leveling what the Europeans got relative to what the United States got in the phase 1 agreement. Okay,
good to know. All right. So next question is from Stephen Overly of Politico. I'm going to throw this one to Ambassador Kirk first. There's a lot of discussion about foreign policy, including trade, needing to serve the middle class, and that being a departure from past administrations. How different will Biden's trade approach be from both Trump and Obama in this regard?
Well, I think given just to some degree, we all bring our own personal narratives and stories and rationales for why we do public service. I think for President Obama, much to a lot of people's surprise, they forgot the fact this is a kid that's a true internationalist. He's raised all over Southeast Asia, spent as much time in Indonesia as he did anywhere else. He very much embraced that. Really, I think, fueled his desire to not turn away from Europe, but to realize the unvested potential we had in being a Pacific power as well. Joe Biden is who he says he is. He's a man of the streets. We've heard him give the speech a million times about being the guy from Scranton. I think he is more strongly bonded in that looking out for the middle class. And so I think you'll see that elevated even more in a Biden-Harris administration than it was in the Obama administration. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing. I remember doing an event like this when I first came in, Clete, and I went over to do something for the Aspen Institute. I gave my little trade speech that my staff had written for me, and nobody told me. Then during the question and answers, they brought out the former Fed Chair Alan Greenspan. And I mean, I about panicked. And Greenspan, the first question he gave me, was the roots of trade. And he said, since when did trade become about, jobs and something rather than the efficiency of moving and producing goods? And I said, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, when our unemployment rate hit 13%. Now, this is where I may differ from trade and chance. For me, this isn't a change. As a mayor, and this is what frustrates me as a Democrat of my own party. If you're not talking about jobs, you're not talking to the American people. And the reality, the dynamics that I think that led to the election of Donald Trump were the same that led to, since we're talking transatlantic, that same dynamics that existed in Europe that led to Brexit. And that as our economies have evolved, we are at a state, the most pressing question facing families in advanced developed economies like in Europe and the US is, where the hell are my kids going to go to work? Where are the next generation of jobs going to come from? And they get trade writ large, but these are people who easily buy the argument that trade now is manifest in Europe and the US as we get cheaper laptops and t-shirts and supplies, but all the jobs are going to, and you fill in the bad actor, Mexico, Malaysia, China. And if we can't draw a straight line between our trade policy and how that's going to fuel economic growth at home and in the future, we're just throwing up, kites in a wind in our face with no string. Now, I think we can do that. I think you can make a very compelling argument that what we did with Panama, Colombia, Korea, what we were attempting to do with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all help us answer that question. And the mayor and me always starts with one simple number with every group. I tell them, we're 5% of the world's population. We aren't going to succeed economically not competing for that other 95%. And the good thing, Made in America is still the most treasured brand in the world. And if we can get out and compete for the hearts and wallets of these new consumers, that's how we drive our economy.
Chris, if you don't mind me just jumping in really, and I'll be concise because I know you've got other questions. But look, I mean, I can't help coming in and quoting Bob Lighthizer, who I also used to work for and work with on this. And what he said during the Trump administration was, well, look, if a t-shirt costs 5 cents more, and that means there's more jobs in Ashtabula, Ohio, well, then that's worth the trade-off. And I think what that did is articulated the worker-centric nature of what the Trump administration tried to do. You saw that manifested with USMCA and as well, and the changes that were made there. But ultimately, I agree with Ambassador Kirk that, look, we need to be exporting abroad. And so we need to figure out, this goes back to this trade-off, our long-term economic prosperity and the jobs in the United States come down to the big companies that employ all those people being able to sell their stuff abroad. So we got to make sure we can preserve that while at the same time, dealing with the dislocations that are wrought from changes in globalization more broadly. I think we spend too much time talking about the trade agreement's impact. I think it's globalization's impact. It's China's rise and the lack of disciplines around that are our problems more than the trade agreements themselves that we've negotiated. Most of our trade agreements actually allow us to access foreign markets and put in place disciplines to deal with the bad stuff. The problem is with countries like China, where we don't have tools to deal with a lot of the bad stuff they're doing. So I think the bigger problem is not trade agreements. I think it's the lack of trade agreements. And that's why, for me, I think the the Biden administration is going to ultimately have to confront this and to say doing no trade agreements is not a worker-centric approach. A worker-centric approach is to do trade agreements that deal with these problems where we don't have disciplines in place. And that's why I say, at the end of the day, let's go back to the Indo-Pacific. Look, Ambassador Kirk, I'd love to do the big comprehensive TPP. I mean, we'd have to update it a little bit because the time has passed. I'd love to do it. I'm just saying, if that's not a realistic proposition, let's at least get engaged in there with building blocks that make the updates we would ultimately want to make, and then we figure out if we can sort of move into it more incrementally.
Okay, so we have, it's 9:53. I'd like to get a couple more questions in. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Bartlett Eads. Tyler, if you can unmute him, Bartlett Eads from CSIS. Try to keep the question fairly concise and just direct it at one of the three, so we can maybe get one more question in after that. Bartlett, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. I'm not going to direct it to anybody, but rather whoever wants to jump on it. My question concerns the United Kingdom. We haven't talked about British interests in building up a post-EU network of trade agreements. We've heard a bit about the difficulties of starting new trade agreements. The Biden administration may not be keen on it, but how would any of you react or advise the new administration to approach the UK in its desire to negotiate an FTA with the US? Thank you.
One of the three of you want to?
I'll jump in quickly, and I'll be quick so others can jump in too if they want. I'd advise them to not leave on the table what we already have achieved through those negotiations. A lot of rounds were held, a lot of progress was made. And if you look at the UK, they don't raise some of the concerns that you might hear from the Democratic base when it comes to trade. I mean, they don't have poor labor standards. On the environment, in a lot of ways, they've been ahead of us, at least ahead of where we were the last 4 years. So most of our exchange is going to be on things in financial services and areas where we're not at a huge competitive disadvantage. So I actually think I would jump on that. I also like the fact that the UK is talking about going into the TPP. So maybe we can find a way to do a deal with the UK, raise the standards there, and then the UK brings those higher standards into the TPP, and that makes it easier for us to join. So I would go full steam ahead.
Okay. All right. So let me see. We've got a question. Clete, you both, I think earlier on you mentioned digital trade. So we have a question from Aditya Chandel from India. Is there going to be any changes in U.S. approaches on the digital tax issue and negotiations happening at the OECD? Can you tackle that one?
Yeah, I can start there and let others chime in as well. The problems are still the same. It is whether or not big tech is popular right now, and on Capitol Hill. The point is, the U.S. is never going to accept a situation where other countries say we are going to adopt a taxing structure that targets the areas where you are most competitive and we are not. And the way the digital taxes have been dealt with right now is that Europe, India, and others have basically said we're going to single out them for more revenue. We're going to put in place thresholds so that only big tech companies get taxed and any of our competitors don't. So that's never going to work for the Biden guys any more than it worked for the Trump guys. And so I think that's a fundamental problem. I think the way to fix it is you look at the distribution of taxing rights for all services providers globally. I mean, if there's a problem with the allocation of taxing because of big tech, there's also a problem because of services. And just to give you one concrete example, why do the DST proposals not work? Because under France's DST, if you try to buy a Louis Vuitton handbag on Amazon's website, you get taxed. But if you go to the Louis Vuitton website to buy the same thing, you don't. So obviously, I think we can see there's a little bit of a discrimination issue we've got going on here. And those are the kinds of things where Europe needs to show flexibility. I think on the US side, you're going to have more engagement, more rhetorical friendliness, as I've put it, maybe attempts to show flexibility. But again, ultimately, we're not going to accept a situation where we're discriminated against. And then remember, we have to go to Congress. If we change all these rules in taxing, we got to go to Congress and get them to approve it. So it's not going to be easy to go to the US Congress and say, yeah, we agreed to this proposal where our companies get taxed more than the rest of the world. And so again, the problems exist. They're going to be the same. I think they're going to try to show a more friendly demeanor and hope that that can yield results. But there needs to be flexibility on the EU side, on the Indian side, as well as on the US side.
Okay, so we just got time for one more question. I'd like to hear from both Chad and Ambassador Kirk on this. And it's not a answer in 3-minute question, but that's all we got. And that's on the politics of it. So just basically, how tough is it going to be to get any kind of trade changes through a 50-50 Senate? Is it whatever the ambitions are? Is the even divide in the Senate going to be, a hurdle that can't be overcome? Chad, could you start, and then we'll end with Ambassador Kirk.
Yeah, I would say it's probably so hard, and there's so many other priorities on the domestic policy front that's facing the administration for the right reasons, that it's extraordinarily unlikely to happen anytime soon. And this is where, we may not call them trade agreements. I think the administration is going to be active on trade. They're going to be action forcing events where they're going to have to respond. But I am not optimistic of seeing great new trade deals in the next couple of years.
Okay, Ambassador Kirk.
Yeah, I would agree with Chad, but I would say, I guess, I always tell people that the definition of an optimist is a pro-trade Democrat who ran for the Senate from Texas. So I may be like those kids in the movies Bad Boys. I'm the guy in the corner telling Chad and Clete it could happen. But let me say this: Chad did say two things, Chris, that are important. It's all a matter of timing. I always find it comical that we start every administration with, particularly with Democrats, the Democrats don't have a trade policy and they're not going to move anything. Well, over the last 50 years, most of the major trade agreements have happened during Democratic administrations. So I am still hopeful we can do it. What I've always said, my mantra is there's never the right time to bring a bad agreement to Congress. But if you can get a good agreement, and all these trade deals, as Clete can tell you, since he's been around, all these trade deals have been difficult. But if we can get agreement that open markets, we can tie to job creation that levels the playing field, that addresses those. I don't think the 50-50 Senate equation really matters that much. It's more of a timing. Certainly, it's not going to happen within the first 24 months. And I just have to say, I would agree with Clete. I think if we're only going to have one bite at the apple, sometime I would hope between year 2 and 3, the economic necessity of rejoining, engaging in TPP is a much clearer path to answer all of those. Because I just don't think, Clete, we're going to have the time or the political will to do it incrementally.